EU pledges an additional $700 million in aid to Afghanistan. G20 leaders discuss how to prevent the country's total economic collapse. Hello, welcome to TRT World. We're live in Istanbul. I'm Adnan Nawaz. Also on the programme, Ethiopia's Tigrayan rebels face a large ground offensive by government forces. It's another critical moment in the 11-month conflict. A parliamentary report finds the British government's early response to the coronavirus pandemic cost thousands of lives. And North Korea's leader says his country will build an invincible military to counter hostile foreign forces. Hello again, thank you very much for your company. Afghanistan's economy is based 40% on international assistance. The country's problems do predate, of course, the Taliban's takeover in August. But the lack of international recognition for the group is making things worse. The European Union has just announced an increase in existing aid, taking its package to $1.2 billion. Italy is hosting a special G20 session on Afghanistan, with many of its members concerned that concurrent crises will force many to leave their homeland. Turkey's president has been speaking to his fellow leaders.
We cannot afford a new migration burden originating from Afghanistan. European countries will inevitably be affected by the migration pressure that Turkey will be exposed to from its southern and eastern borders. We consider it essential for the G20 to keep the issues of migration and forced displacement on its agenda, keeping in mind its implications for the global economy. We propose the creation of a new working group within the G20 to bring systematic perspective to this global problem, and we would like Turkey to lead this group.
Well, 2 months after the Taliban's takeover, the United Nations says 9 out of 10 Afghan families report the only food they're able to buy on a daily basis is bread. People have been losing their jobs or they haven't been getting paid. A drought has dried up crops and the prices of basic goods have soared. The UN Secretary General is appealing to the international community to help Afghanistan financially.
So we need to inject cash in the economy. I'm not saying that I'm asking the international community to give money to the Taliban or to the present authorities. No, we need to inject cash in the economy. We need to make the economy breathe. We need to allow people to survive. That is our concern. The questions of recognition and the questions of dealing with government are totally different, and can be dealt with, of course, through the principles of international law and other principles. What I'm talking now is to find instruments to inject liquidity in the economy, in the people, to benefit the people.
Let's go to our correspondent Hassan Abdullah in Kabul. Hassan, there's a key issue here. And after their second face-to-face meeting over the weekend in Doha, the Taliban said the Americans have agreed to provide humanitarian assistance, and we, the Taliban, can be involved in helping distribute that assistance. The Americans haven't confirmed that, but that's one of the big keys for the international community. How do they get aid to Afghanistan while not recognizing the Taliban, and therefore the difficulties in asking the Taliban to be involved in this aid, which is also financial as well as humanitarian, of course?
You're right, Adnan. That's the mechanism part, which has been discussed quite extensively here in Kabul. We've seen meetings between Taliban officials and people from the United Nations and various bodies. They've been talking about it. Now, my understanding, based on discussions with Taliban officials, is that they've said that they're willing for a third party to work as far as the distribution is concerned. So, for example, there are a number of relief organizations currently operating in Turkey. Taliban has said that it's going to allow them free access to different areas. They can basically receive the humanitarian aid. There will be no obstacles in the way, and they can do the distribution. So that's one mechanism which has been discussed. The Taliban has also been doing some distribution work, particularly in the rural areas that have traditionally remained neglected. Especially when it comes to many organizations that rely on local networks here. So I think the Taliban is trying to get countries to basically give that assistance and channel it through Taliban as well. But the discussions with Taliban officials would indicate that they are willing for third parties to operate. So, for example, we have Turkey's organizations like IHH, Turkish Red Crescent that have been working here, various other organizations. So I think that option is there. But considering the gravity of the situation, I don't think the assistance that's coming in at the moment is sufficient. A lot more needs to be done.
What about news of getting people to come back to their places of work? I mean, there's one particular issue. Again, this one's about women, with the Taliban saying a few weeks ago that if a man can do a particular job, there's no reason for a woman to do it. But then there's the wider picture of simply getting people back to work.
That's right. We've seen women returning to work in some of the institutions. For example, at the passport office, many women have returned. They're working there. I think this just reflects, Adnan, the sort of internal difference of opinion within the Taliban. The old guard are basically the ones who are saying that why do you need women to work when men can do that? And the sort of younger leadership and those who've spent a lot of time in Qatar, who have their own relatives, their own daughters studying at universities, they are basically the ones who are saying that there is no Islamic problem with it. The old guard, of course, remains powerful, very influential, and I think what they don't want to do is basically allow these differences to fragment them. So they're trying to maintain and present this united front, and this is why we've seen issues like the delay in the opening of girls' secondary school, which, when you talk to even some people in the old guard, they can't deny the Islamic position on education being obligatory for everyone, male or female. But then there is this politics and division and about the assertion of oneself coming in. So that politics is also influencing decisions here.
Hassan, thank you so much. Our correspondent Hassan Abdullah in Kabul. Just a small percentage of votes left to be counted in Iraq, and the election results from Sunday show the Sadrist movement of the Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr increasing its number of seats in parliament. There are great challenges ahead, not least the low turnout that shows the disenchantment of people with their politicians. TRT World's Hadia Al-Alawi is in Baghdad.
We saw a lot of celebrations since yesterday on the street, mainly from the supporters of Muqtada al-Sadr, who took to the street. They were in cars carrying the banners, carrying here the Iraqi flag, and also carrying his pictures. They say this is a win for nationalism, and they're actually really happy about the result. But also, there are different factions within the government, and every faction is definitely going to say that this result maybe isn't good and it's fabricated. The feeling on the street is very split, though. There's those who boycotted the vote in the first place who are feeling quite indifferent about the result anyway because they didn't participate in the election. But there's those who actually did take to the ballot and chose the ones that they want in the parliament, and they got the result. They say they got the result that they wanted, and they're saying this is a win for Iraq.
Elections that some hoped would usher in a new roadmap for the country's future has seen the Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr's party victorious.
Thank God, who has honored our bloc. It's a purely Iraqi bloc that is controlled by neither the East or the West. Its elite comes from Iraqi people and the Iraqi resources. There is no place for corruption or corrupt people anymore.
Polls were held several months early under a new law designed to help independent candidates, a response to mass anti-government protests 2 years ago. But the established, armed and Shia-dominated ruling elite, as expected, swept the vote. The Sadrist movement, led by al-Sadr, has came first and increased its numbers of seats in parliament.
They were nominated before, and they have been here for 20 years with no competitors. We have not benefited from anything.
The movement ran on a nationalist platform, seeking to set itself apart from Iran-backed Shia factions. But many Iraqis have expressed a loss of faith in the country's democratic process and political class.
In our country, the leaders don't know what democracy is. But this is an attempt. This is an attempt, a hope for change. We wait for all change, and we hope that all our problems end. We will see.
The Shia Muslim blocs have dominated parliament since the US-led invasion in 2003. which overthrew Saddam Hussein's regime and ushered in a power-sharing system that has allowed a narrow elite to keep a firm grip on power. Nonetheless, some voters have expressed optimism.
Iraq is restoring its strategic and regional role. Iraq is restoring its ability to be a stronger partner in the region and not a hub for conflicts and a place where powers can get even with each other.
Monday's result is not expected to dramatically alter the balance of power in the country or the wider Middle East, according to many Iraqi officials, diplomats and analysts.
The result may be a win for Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr's party, but it was delivered amidst record-breaking low voter turnout, signaling perhaps that the growing discontent in Iraq, especially amongst the youth, is unlikely to be dispelled by any election.
Next will come negotiations to choose a prime minister tasked with forming a government, but that is expected to take weeks or even months.
The EU's chief election observer in Iraq says the process was technically well managed.
EU observers have assessed that voting on election days was largely peaceful, calm and orderly. And I commend Iraq and its people for this conduct. Voters were able to freely express their will. Party agent and domestic citizens observers were present in the vast majority of polling stations, and voting procedures were largely followed. The overall conduct of the voting was rated positively in 95% of the polling stations visited by our observers.
The Ethiopian army has launched a ground and air offensive against rebels in the northern province of Tigray. Addis Ababa has imposed a news blackout across the region, but confirmation of the assault has come from the TPLF themselves. The rebels say government forces are trying to re-invade Tigray. There's been no official comment from the government, but earlier a senior official said it had a responsibility to protect its citizens in all parts of the country. The conflict began in November. It's left thousands dead, hundreds of thousands displaced, and 350,000 suffering from famine. Samuel Getachew has more from Ethiopia.
Well, this was expected to happen. The Ethiopian side has been saying this was coming. They haven't said it per se. They usually talk on social media, but the Ethiopian Prime Minister was in regional states, including Uganda, Rwanda. He was also in Turkey looking for some kind of support, particularly from Turkey, which its drones and which its military assistance played a powerful role in between the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and they're looking at a repeat within the conflict that began, as you said, in November. It's not just in the Tigray region, it's also in the Amhara region, in the Afari region. The conflict that was supposed to have been within the Tigray region has really impacted regional states, making thousands of Ethiopians facing famine. According to the UN, just in Tigray alone, close to 1 million people are facing famine in Amhara and Afar regions. It's a repeat of what we've been seeing in Tigray from a distance. So this really has impacted thousands of Ethiopians and displaced, again, close to at least approximately 2 million Ethiopians as a result.
Stay with us. We're going to be live in Lebanon. The investigation into the Beirut port explosion is suspended again.
Hello and welcome to Showcase, TRT World's arts and culture programme coming to you from Istanbul. A unique perspective on culture, an inside look at art, influential guests and current trends, the latest fashion, inventive design, architecture, ancient and modern, all packed into Showcase on TRT World.
Welcome back to TRT World. These are our top stories. The European Union has announced an increase of an existing aid package for Afghanistan, taking its total to $1.2 billion. And the UN Secretary-General is asking the international community to help the country financially to prevent its total economic collapse. Ethiopia's army has launched a ground and air offensive against Tigrayan rebels in the north. That's according to the rebels themselves. They say coordinated attacks are taking place and that thousands have died. There's been no statement so far from Addis Ababa. The probe into last year's Beirut port explosion has been suspended again after two former ministers facing charges lodged a new legal complaint against the lead investigator. The suspension means the lead judge will not be able to question the ex-Minister of Public Works and the former Minister of the Interior. Let's go to Beirut and speak to Imogen Kimber. Imogen, does this mean that the judge will never be able to speak to those two ministers, or may eventually be able to?
He may eventually be able to, but what they've done is they've managed to kick it down, kick the can down the road. He's scheduled this week. He was resuming his work, as you say, after two attempts last month to have him removed. This week he had scheduled to meet with the former Finance Minister, Minister of Public Works, Minister of Interior and the former Prime Minister, who's actually abroad. But the former Finance Minister didn't show up. Then he issued an arrest for warrant for him, and it was only after he'd issued that arrest for warrant that him and the Minister for Public Works, who, as I say, was also lined up for questioning, created this third formal complaint against the judge, which means that it has to be suspended. Now, the former Finance Minister currently doesn't have immunity as the Parliament's not in sitting, but by October the 19th, he will have immunity. And all of this comes after a speech from Hassan Nasrallah yesterday, who added kind of his point of view to the pile and said that he also thinks that the judge should be removed as he's accused of political bias, which is something, of course, that's not reflected by legal organisations here or by the family of the families of victims of the Beirut blast.
OK, I mean, I don't know how Lebanese law works, but presumably a lot of the victims, not only those who died, but who had homes destroyed and whose livelihoods were affected, they will need to wait for the official report that the lead judge is compiling and is investigating before they might be able to claim even more damages if some money has already been paid out.
Well, that's certainly true as well, and that report, you know, is a long way off if the judge is if this is constantly being pushed down the road. Now, what the ministers are being accused of doing by the families of the victims and by, as I mentioned, Legal Agenda, a legal watchdog here, is that they're deliberately obstructing the course of justice, that they refuse to vote away their own immunity that would allow them to be investigated properly, and that this is a tactic actually that isn't a one-off, that this is a systematic abuse of powers. The use of immunity is you know, as I say, abused by politicians, as is the accusation that Hassan Nasrallah made last night that the judge is biased and has a political leaning. They tell us that that's something that's commonly used in Lebanon, that's so divided along sectarian lines. It stirs up a public feeling, and it brings the whole investigation to a halt, as it has done this time, while he has to be investigated. So essentially, you know, it's in a sense obstructing the course of justice.
Imogen, thank you so much. Imogen Kimber in Beirut. Mistakes by the British government and scientific advisors in the early days of the coronavirus pandemic cost thousands of lives. This is according to a report compiled by British lawmakers. The findings relate almost exclusively to England rather than any of the UK's other nations. So let's just go through some of the main findings. The first infections in the UK, they were confirmed in January. The report says delaying the first lockdown until March led to deaths that may have been avoided. Rather than introducing stay-at-home orders, the report has found Boris Johnson's government was pursuing a herd immunity approach. In other words, it thought if enough people became infected, that would be the only way to stop the virus. The decision to abandon COVID-19 testing in the community early on, that also cost many lives, as did failing to prioritise social care and discharging people from hospitals into care homes without enough testing or requirements that they isolate from other elderly residents. The publication says more robust border controls were needed sooner, but the report does call the country's vaccine rollout one of the most effective initiatives in the UK's history. Our correspondent Simon McGregor-Wood says the blame for the poor response is being directed at scientists as well as politicians.
And it's interesting to note that it doesn't accuse individuals. It seems to accuse structures not being up to the task of responding to a pandemic. If you look at some of the criticism contained in the report, it starts well before the pandemic with the kind of pandemic preparation this country had in place. It was the wrong kind for COVID. It was focused too narrowly on influenza. And when it came about, largely because COVID-19 was asymptomatic, the NHS, Public Health England, all the other structures meant to respond to this kind of crisis just didn't have the tools necessary. The report says that ministers and scientists were operating in a fog of uncertainty. And it is interesting to note that there's a lot of political criticism of Boris Johnson's reaction to it, but I think he will, if he is so minded to look at this in any sense of relief, get some sense of relief that the blame seems to be equally distributed between the politicians and the scientists. At the time, you'll remember perhaps the rather tiresome refrain that government ministers were putting out were following the science. And in the early stages of this, the scientific advice was just wrong. And time again, we heard chief medical officers and the chief government scientist talking about it not being necessary to close borders, masks didn't necessarily have an effect, the British public wouldn't tolerate an extended lockdown, etc., etc. And if you accept that Boris Johnson, given his ideological commitment to free and open societies, he doesn't like the notion of big government and restricting people's activities, he was allowed to avoid those difficult decisions because the scientific advice wasn't pushing him. There is criticism of the political class for not questioning the scientific advice robustly enough.
North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un has blamed the United States for tensions on the Korean peninsula. Speaking at a defense exhibition, Kim said Washington is the root cause of instability. He's also defended his country's weapons program as necessary in the face of hostile U.S. policies, saying because of Washington's position, Pyongyang is going to build an invincible military, but that none of its actions are intended for war, rather for self-defense.
According to the speech made by North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, Pyongyang's weapons development is needed because of hostile policies from the United States as well as South Korea's military buildup. Now, to drive this home, he made these remarks in front of a variety of weapons, including an intercontinental ballistic missile, which was shown in the ruling party's newspaper. And within that speech, Kim argued that the country is only advancing its military might in terms of self-defense, not for war, and not against certain countries like South Korea and the U.S. Kim also accused Seoul and Washington of being hypocritical and having double standards for continuing to boost its military capabilities while talking about peace and prosperity. So we're seeing North Korea going from one end of the spectrum, including missile tests and weapons tests, to the other side of the spectrum where they are saying this positive rhetoric about bettering inter-Korean ties, and that's why it becomes very tricky. We heard from North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, saying that the country is ready to better inter-Korean relations and is open to doing so. But analysts suggest that all of this was done in order to drive a wedge between Seoul and Washington, which are key allies, especially in regards to the North Korean denuclearization denuclearization issue. And we also know that North Korea has recently reconnected communication lines with the South, which happened after Pyongyang had unilaterally severed the communication lines and then ignored calls by South Korea. This is all happening while they are continuing to push its missile program, and analysts suggest that they've begun to expand its main nuclear reactor, which is used to produce fuel for nuclear bombs.
A couple of stories in brief for you. We'll start here in Turkey, where the Coast Guard says more than 300 irregular migrants have been rescued in the Aegean Sea over the past 24 hours. They were apparently pushed back into Turkish waters by Greek authorities. Turkey is a key transit point for migrants hoping to reach Europe. Rallies against President Luis Arce have been held in several cities across Bolivia. These are the largest anti-government protests since 2019. Those 2 years ago ended with the resignation of the then-president, Evo Morales. 10 years after her death, the musical legacy of the British soul singer Amy Winehouse survives. And fans now have a chance to share a part of that legacy, as Yunus Paksoy explains.
This beautiful custom-made purse by Moschino for Amy Winehouse.
Hundreds of personal items that belong to the Grammy-winning singer Amy Winehouse are up for auction. One of the most sought-after items